So I was paying attention online here pretty recently. I noticed some stuff that made its rounds about birth control, and some guys by the name of Michael Knowles, and of course we all know Elon Musk. They kind of set things a little bit on fire, which, I mean, credit to the mad lads. Well, at least they appear mad, I would say. The sane will appear mad in a world ruled by madness. Anyways, they decided to blow up the internet, and they re-blew up some of that stuff regarding birth control, which is kind of a golden calf in society. Anyways, so Elon Musk had brought up in his tweet that set everything on fire three really big factors about how birth control affects the body. It affects the mind, and it really affects your relationship with others, which is just a roundabout way to say makes you fat, unhappy, and less likely to stick around living. So, what about birth control making you fat? Like, how does that work? Okay, cool. So one of the major roles of like your fat tissue in general is to help convert your hormones. So in terms of a process, it takes a sulfated form of one of your major estrogens, estrone, because there's more than one. It'll cut off that little sulfur group, and then it'll convert that into estradiol. Okay, so then it takes your androgens also and converts them via what's known as the aromatization pathway. This is also how you convert sugar. Guys, stay away from sugar. Anyways, you go down a little bit deeper, and there's 8 different ways in which the body can actually initiate the aromatizing effect, and it'll do it in different tissues. Moreover, there's a little thing called microRNA, which helps actually regulate and control some of that fat tissue function, right? So there's already a whole lot of stuff going on just inside the fat tissue alone with hormone. And fun fact, actually, your brain, blood vessels, and bones all play a role in this. But of course, reproductive organs are the best, ladies, overall. Now, when we go a little bit deeper, remember that microRNA. Your estrogens will actually help manage a lot of your gene expressions, and it'll do it directly. So it'll actually go to a little thing called an estrogen receptor, right? And it'll help to control DNA expression directly that way. So your estrogens will literally affect your DNAs. So here's a fun fact. BPA is something that'll actually bind to estrogen receptors as well. So this is why BPA long-term is a chronic toxic stressor. Now, one of the other things to keep in mind with estrogens is that they also help regulate the location, activity, and like all these other things about those adipocytes. And poor levels of estrogens will really deregulate a lot of that stuff. Not to mention, whether it's low level or high level, both I would say are a poor level of estrogen. Now, what's one of those other things that they do, since we see that they can regulate a lot of our genetics? And genes are really just a way for your body to adapt. Your estrogens will actually affect that insulin sensitivity of your adipose tissue. Now, how does that work? Let's break that down a little bit, because we have to do a little bit of a long loop. So your estrogen receptors, you have alpha and you have betas, right? Depending on their ratios, based on the gene expression that's being demanded by the body, right? You'll see a difference. So that ties up to the hypothalamus, because that activity gets regulated by your estrogens as well. So already we have receptors that are affecting insulin, the activity of adipocytes, and now you pull in the hypothalamus, right, which will help signal energy regulation, right? Do we need to eat more? Do we need to eat less? Estrogens are going to affect that. How it does that is through these little things called neuropeptide Y and ghrelin. Okay, normally it maintains a good balance. But when you disrupt your estrogens, you're going to disrupt your levels of neuropeptide Y, for example. Thus, you're going to actually decrease your appetite. You're thinking, okay, doc, how does that affect your fat tissue? Quite simple. Your body can get pushed into a starvation mode with poor energy demand over time. But on the flip side, you also have to keep in mind ghrelin is a part of that, because neuropeptide Y inhibits ghrelin. Okay, and ghrelin is going to drive some of that desire to intake food. Okay, now let's look at it from the estrogen receptor side more specifically. You can be looking at like an obesity or insulin resistance issue, but you can also have obesity and really strong insulin resistance going on. I've seen both. Estrogens are going to help manage some of that, because they also really regulate your fat breakdown functions. For example, they're actually going to increase the conversion of triglycerides, the fat and energy storage molecule, over to free fatty acids, actually usable energy. When you disrupt that, your body's normal ability to regulate fat breakdown takes a pretty major hit. That's why a lot of ladies, like postmenopausally, they end up having a lot of fat tissue accumulation. Now, is that because they're now postmenopausal and all of a sudden their body just doesn't remember how to make estrogens? No, for all of history, that's not always been the case, because your body's still able to produce those estrogens postmenopausally. You just don't need to do this with your hormones anymore. Okay, hormone stays kind of like that. That's a lot more of what the postmenopausal should look like. What about premenopausal? What happens when we got that going on? Birth control. really great way to disrupt that. You trick your body into thinking it's pregnant. You suppress a lot of your estrogens by tossing a whole bunch of progesterone in the system. And I understand there's various forms of birth control. Some are progestin only. Not as often are we using the estrogen only anymore because we figured out, hey, that's very detectably bad for you because we can see those changes in cancer rates. A lot more often you see progesterone plus estrogen. But either way, all of them are disrupting the body. Because here's the thing, your body will target specific areas for the accumulation and the breakdown of fat tissue. It can differentiate between visceral, so like around your organs, right? Which is a really bad place for long-term storage of fat. And then your subcutaneous, right? Which is really the place where it's best put at, okay? Because ladies, like your body is meant to put its fat tissue in particular places, right? Things that add more curve, less roll is really what we should be seeing. But just kind of a fun fact with PCOS, right? So classically, you're looking at an androgen production issue, mainly through an insulin resistance, creating a block in the ovaries, preventing normal FSH and LH regulation. Because here's the thing, that insulin will bind to the same locations that those hormones come in. You need your luteinizing hormone. You need your follicle stimulating hormone. What does the follicle stimulating hormone do? Produce a follicle, right? Start developing those follicles into eggs, right? But then you need the LH to help release it. You can end up with what's called the string of pearls sign if you're familiar with ultrasounds. What is the string of pearls from? FSH getting blocked. You're not developing the follicle correctly. LH getting blocked. You're not releasing it correctly. Insulin has a huge role in that. So then where does the androgen part come into it? Fun fact, your ovaries actually produce a lot of your androgens, but then it needs to convert it. And insulin's going to interfere with that conversion if we get locked in that situation. So then you look at those estrogen receptors. Those will alter their ratios in response to the availability of your estrogens. And then they go one step deeper. They're actually going to regulate some of your mitochondrial activity, specifically in your adipocytes. Looking at it just a little bit like more from simply an energetic standpoint, your fat tissue will also store your steroid hormones. It doesn't just convert them, okay? So fun fact, chronic inflammation will actually trigger your fat tissue, your adipocytes, to physically increase in size. And it's a defensive mechanism to help protect it against metabolic dysfunction. Imagine that your body's smart and is going to try and store something it can't do something with, right? It's going to try and neutralize it that way. But just like speaking of conversions, right? Your fat tissue handles, it's going to pull in 3 different hormones, right? Remember that little sulfation thing that we talked about? It has a huge amount of things that it does. With just 3 hormones, DHEA, DHEAS, and androstenedione, it can convert them, shift them around 10 different ways. Okay, that's a lot to do with just a few hormones just in your adipose tissue. Now, remember earlier when we were talking about there being multiple forms of birth control? Let's talk a little bit more about progesterone, because those most forms of birth control are based on that, well, progestins. But anyways, we end up with a similar like end effect, right? It just goes about it in different ways. Because here's the thing. If you force progesterone into the body, your body has to respond to a pretty massive upset in its normal balance of hormones, because there's time where it's up, time where it's down. That's why we have different weeks of the cycle. So what happens to the body when you trick it into thinking it's pregnant without any of the other functions that start with pregnancy? People will oftentimes look at, and they'll be very cynical about it. Oh, I'm just growing a parasite right now. That's really not only inaccurate, but it's silly at best, foolish at worst. Because here's the thing, when that baby is developing, it is actually helping your body produce and convert hormones as well. Women that have at least one kid will actually see a huge decrease in their breast cancer rates. Why? Because your body changes itself in response to there being baby. But when you just throw progesterone-based birth control in there, you don't get that benefit. So you're literally getting all the negatives and none of the positives, or all the unpleasantness with none of the benefit. So one of the ways which your body's going to deal with that additional progesterone is through converting it in the kidneys, especially when there's higher levels for a long time. It's going to turn it into something called deoxycorticosterone, which is going to act like a mineral corticosteroid in your body, which is one of your major ways of regulating your fluid balance, which is why a lot of ladies feel like they're swelling when they're on that progestin or progesterone-based birth control, because they're literally screwing with their kidneys, right? It's not just your ovaries, it's your whole body. You have estrogen receptors on practically every organ, okay? This affects everything. Now, that deoxycorticosteroid, what else about that is important? It's actually going to regulate part of your estrogen sulfuration. So your body is going to have to now deal with additional signals to move its estrogens around. And progesterone can and will be converted into estrogens as well. Remember that steroid hormone chart? Put it up, my lovely editor. Look at how that is going to move down through those pathways. It takes a couple steps, but it is going to get there. Now, estrogen will affect your insulin. So does progesterone, mainly through stimulation effect. In its natural balance, you're going to have some great back and forth with the estrogens and the progesterone helping to rise and fall and move it around. On its own, okay, you do have to be careful with that insulin resistance now. Because guess what? It's there to help move energy into organs, especially glycogen, into the liver and move energy into cells for storage. AKA, you're going to now trigger actual fat accumulation. In context of pregnancy, this is great. But out of context of pregnancy, why do you think some ladies, again, feel swollen? It's not just that mineralocorticosteroid effect. It's throwing a giant hormonal monkey wrench into the system. You're going to have a lot of these things being pretty badly affected. So what about the depression component? Okay, here's where we get like really fun. So fun fact, your body produces its own drugs. So progesterone will actually help your body. It's really closely related to your natural opioid system, right? You make your own drugs, especially in the spine. Now, as a chiropractor, remember, a lot of my time is spent with somebody's physical spine, okay? At a more natural level of progesterone. It will help even out your mood because of that opioid effect. It's going to help control pain as well. A lot of great things that get really abused when you're doing opioid drugs. But at high levels, it's going to act like an opioid drug. It's going to start to shut down parts of your brain that deal with your emotional regulation. You become literally numb to the world around you and even inside of you. Ladies, how many of you have had that effect when you're on birth control? You just stop feeling things. You stop caring about some things. Right? Oh, that one does bug me because I get to see a lot of, I see a lot of that, both when I was growing up with my friends, but also with like within the context of practice. But going back to the idea that your body has to deal with what it's exposed to, progesterone is going to have a couple different forms that it exists in. It's also like the estrogens where it's like a blanket term. Same thing with progesterone. It's a little bit more easy to isolate, but it still has at least 4 metabolites or converted forms. They all have their own effects on the body. Some are all pretty crazy, like in what they can do, but they all share an effect on GABA, right? It's a really calming hormone to your body, especially the brain. But these are all neurosteroids at the end of the day. They all modulate that GABA. At a normal level, it's great because it helps you sleep. It keeps you calm. You feel good. Like GABA is great. But you wonder why eventually people get zonked out on that birth control. Not only are you affecting the opioid system, but you're seriously flooding the body with abnormal levels of hormone for an abnormal period of time with an abnormal limit on the normal controls. Nothing about it is normal for the body. And yet we think it's the greatest thing ever. It's a golden calf. You can't question birth control, otherwise you hate women. No, I love women quite a lot. They were actually the majority of my friend group growing up. I care very deeply about them, which is why I hate birth control, because I see what it does. And when you study a little bit of normal physiology, you get to understand long-term how this damages the body. Here's the thing. Your progesterone-based birth control is really progestin. It's a synthetic form, okay? So when you block that normal progesterone from binding and working, you don't end up in a similar place at all. You really screw up the normal. You get out of that cylinder because that progestin is going to bind. Because it's a synthetic form, it's going to bind to the same receptor. But it's not going to have the same signaling effect. It's just now blocking that hormone. Think of it like, I'm trying to get this to connect to this, right? Well, that progestin comes along and it's shaped like that, right? It doesn't actually trigger anything, and it prevents the normal from getting into it. You don't get the calming effect of progesterone now. You don't get that easing, that sense of well-being that comes from your normal hormones. Ladies, you know when you're in balance because you feel amazing. Worse yet, those progesterones, which is the most common form of progesterone-based birth control, can and do exert androgenic effects on your body, which is a double whammy, double insult. Because that's where part of that suicidality will eventually come into it, because now you know you don't feel normal, but you should be, and your body's screaming all these different directions. It's lost its normal function because you've interfered with it and somebody told you it was a great idea. Regarding how birth control can create a suicidality, when somebody's caught red-handed, they'll either tell you not to trust your lying eyes, or you're better off because now you have some other thing in your life, okay? oh, birth control allows me to do this. Isn't that great? I mean, I feel like killing myself, but I guess I can go do this one thing, right? In the case of hormonal birth control, Denmark decided to ask a very simple question. What's going on with women of our country? What is this doing to our people? So a very simple study was done. It was done with over 500,000 women, okay? They had an average of 8 years of follow-up. This is a gold mine of a study, right? Any study that can manage to do that kind of follow-up, to have that number of people involved, it's really hard to argue with that, especially when they do the controls necessary to help account for socioeconomic and other things like that. So what do they find? Estradiol birth control notably increased suicidality attempts. Progesterone-only birth controls was actually worse than estradiol. Non-oral birth controls actually had the worst outcomes. Now, the worst part is that the most immediate issues peaked at within 2 months of usage. But for years afterwards, remember they had an 8-year follow-up, these women continued to be at significantly higher risk than the women who didn't take it at all. A major aspect of the whole issue of endocrine disruption, modifying your hormones artificially, is the long term. People are very caught up in the short term. What am I getting if I do that? What can I enjoy, or what can I indulge, or what can I have? There's a lot that comes with it. But even outside of that, because not everyone is given birth control so they can go live a wild life. Some people are given birth control because they feel like they're losing their mind when they're on their period. It feels like it's killing them. That can either be due to a low or a high hormone issue, right? Your body's not properly converting, or it's not properly producing and or converting. Because there's a lot of different components that exist within that. For the lady that has actually low hormones, right, getting that birth control can make her feel the best ever, because now you're giving the body just some resources, or the appearance of resources. You're still going to have some of the negative effects from it because it's still not what your body needs, but boy howdy, it can get you some relief for a little while. But if you don't get past that, well, now you become dependent on these things, and that is going to have that long-term negative effect on your body. Dealing with health restoration, that's really what we do in a situation like that. Why isn't your body functioning normally? Let's test it. Let's find it. Same thing, like for those ladies on the high hormone side, you get that birth control and holy crap, you feel nuts. Tell me, like, more than a couple ladies I've interacted with. Yeah, I felt like a psycho when I was on this. Yeah, because now you just threw a whole bunch of additional stuff into the body. But the frustrating thing for what I see from like how women are taught and told about this is that you get hammered with the consequences of being told you can start birth control and then you can stop it and things will go back to normal, no problem. That's probably one of the most insulting things. If your body's in a good state, okay, maybe it can indeed go back that way, but artificially altering those functions mean you're going to need to be particular about helping repair those damaged functions, because that's what happens. Right? I've seen the lab work of young ladies that got hit with all sorts of endocrine disruptors, testosterone, birth control, etc. And their body did manage to come back to some level of normalcy. But their liver showed a lot of signs of being really beaten up. It couldn't even unbind its hormone to make it useful in a lot of capacities. Because imagine this, the body's smart. It decided to try and catch all this additional hormone and prevent it from exerting a damaging effect. Your body knows what it needs. You just have to give it the resources to do it. So anyways, her hormone production was kind of all right, but like I said, it couldn't free it up for getting use, because when you add in a whole bunch of stuff, because the body's smart, well, then you end up with just flubberknocking the whole thing. But when I looked at and examined how her body was using the little bit it could unbind, it wasn't really processing it. Remember, her liver got totally borked, right? There's a lot of ways in which the body can get pretty much screwed up. Is it a production issue? Is it a conversion issue? Right? Where's the body struggling after it got that endocrine disruption, that damage? And remember, a lot of people don't feel normal after touching birth control, and no one told you there'd be work to do to get back to normal. But again, that's what we do here at the Wellness Way, right? We figure out what those normal functions have been damaged, what they're trying to do. We help provide the resources necessary to help the body deflame and begin that normal repair process. How many times have you heard your doctor say, your lab work is all fine, nothing abnormal here, it's probably just in your head? Are you depressed or anxious? Here's medication. We've all been to the doctor and heard that kind of thing. Doc, I don't feel normal. Well, your lab work says things are normal, so it's in your head. Excuse me, but I'm having this, I'm having that, I'm going through this. Like very objective things in your life, and it's ignored because it doesn't show up in the lab work. all the time. We run a lab and say, here's where your problem is. This is why that's happening. And connecting those dots for people, the why behind their health, right? I've seen a lot of women, young, old, all hurt by birth control and given no guidance on how to get their life back to normal. But again, that's what we do. So, what do I think about how they approach that whole thing? Birth control will increase your levels of fat tissue. It will damage your normal psychological health. Don't do it. Not in a million years would I let my own family do something like this. I would much rather go through the process of testing them, making sure, finding where, and being sure of what's interfering with their normal function. If you don't do that, if you don't know what's going on, why would you ever add something that disrupts the system more? But, anyways, what do I know? I'm just a crazy chiropractor that happens to understand a little bit more how the body should function normally. We'll see how it plays out with the clinical results. Anyways, a little bit of salt came through on that one, guys. Gals, I hope you enjoy this, or at least you find something good. And if it irritates you a little bit, please do leave a comment. I would like to know how this irritates you, because that's where we'll have a little bit of some back and forth. I'm more than happy to engage anyone that disagrees with me. Have a good rest of your day, guys.